Welcome back. You're watching live from Paris on France 24. It's time now for Focus. Now, France and Britain were originally the driving force behind the NATO assault on Libya. Now, though, Paris is finding itself increasingly isolated from its allies. Well, it was the only country to take the controversial step of arming Libya's rebels. Now, France says NATO's bombs aren't working and it's time for talks with the Gaddafi regime. Well, Paris denies that it's been engaged in direct talks with the regime in Tripoli. We'll have more on that from tonight's guest in a moment. First, though, this report on the story so far.
4 months after the coalition went into Libya, France looks to be revising its mission objectives. Until now, ousting Colonel Gaddafi from power was the preferred outcome of NATO airstrikes on the country. But now there seems to have been a shift in French strategy, with Paris implying diplomacy might be the best way to resolve the conflict.
We'll stop the airstrikes as soon as the Libyans start negotiations and when soldiers on both sides return to their barracks. We've stopped Gaddafi from harming his people. Now they have to get around the table.
Even if Gaddafi stays?
He will be in another room in his palace and he'll have a different title.
So NATO could stop its military operation if Gaddafi's regime and the rebels agree to start a dialogue. Such a position was unimaginable just a few months ago. In March, French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé seemed convinced it wouldn't take long to remove the brother leader from office.
Well, when you use heavy weapons, military aircraft and tanks to open fire on your own people, when you threaten an entire city with bloodshed and when you're being investigated by the International Criminal Court and the UN has placed sanctions on you, you're clearly offside. That's what France believes anyway, and so do many of our partners.
Colonel Gaddafi's camp appeared to be taking advantage of the confusion over France's position. His son, Saif al-Islam, claims to be negotiating directly with Paris. But this was slapped down by the French Foreign Ministry, who say their communications were not negotiations. Rather, they were conveying a message via him to Gaddafi. Meanwhile, even though the rebels have consolidated their gains, the conflict seems to be at a stalemate. The capital, Tripoli, is still in the hands of Gaddafi's troops.
We're asking Gaddafi to abandon the most precious thing in his life, his political power. We're even asking him to leave his country. From the beginning, these conditions were unrealistic and unattainable. I think that the Defence Ministry's reaction is a realisation of this.
Pressure is mounting on Nicolas Sarkozy and other coalition leaders to end NATO operations in Libya. A recent survey in France showed 51% of French people disapprove of the conflict, saying it's taking too long and claiming too many lives. But in France, at least, the impasse will have to be broken soon. That could happen on Tuesday, when the French Parliament votes whether or not to continue its military efforts in Libya.
Well, for more on that story, I'm joined now by Sir Richard Dalton. He's the former British ambassador to Libya. Many thanks for being with us tonight. Now, first of all, do you agree with France? Is it time to start talking to Gaddafi?
By all means, put out feelers, but I think it would be wrong for the coalition, and France in particular, to negotiate independently of the National Transitional Council in Benghazi, which France was one of the first countries to recognise. I don't agree that the conflict is in a stalemate. I believe that the opposition is making steady gains, and I don't understand the idea that just because the leader of Libya doesn't want to give up power, it should be so totally unrealistic to ask him to abandon it. After all, we saw the fall of Zayn bin Ali al-Abidine in Tunisia and of President Mubarak in Egypt. And the fact is there is a similarly general demand in Libya that there should be serious change in that country too.
If we do enter negotiations with Gaddafi, should he be allowed to stay on in some sort of role?
Well, the bottom line is that there should be a free act of self-determination about Libya's future. And I don't believe that the opposition in Benghazi considers that such a free act would be possible in the presence of Colonel Gaddafi and with his forces still potentially able to mount a comeback. So if there were to be any negotiation, and that may be necessary eventually at a time when the National Transitional Council is ready, and at a time when there has been further military pressure on the regime, then that negotiation should take place under the clear demand, as endorsed recently by the United States, and I believe is still the UK position, that Gaddafi be far from any exercise of power.
Why do you think France is calling for these talks now? Do you think France is more weary of this war than some of its allies?
Well, that's possible, but I'm only speculating because I have no insights into what the French government is thinking. But given the apparent belief of commentators that the vote in Parliament will go in favour of continuing the fighting, I find it very strange that France should have made this initiative to publicise the idea of a change in the aims of the coalition just before there is a general meeting of that coalition in the form of the contact group meeting in Istanbul. So there will have to be some hard discussions there to find out exactly what is the French position and to decide what is best for the implementation of the UN Security Council resolution on Libya.
Now, Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, claimed today that France actually created the transitional council that rules Libya. France, of course, admitted to arming the rebels earlier this month. Do you think that France is too close to the rebels at this stage?
No, I don't think so at all. I don't think they have a substantially different relationship with the rebels than any other country that is currently supporting them, whether from within the Arab world or the European or North American world. The fact is that the Libyan people created the National Transitional Council. It is a genuinely popular revolution which began in the east of the country, but is clearly extending to the west as well. So I don't agree that there is currently a stalemate. If you look at it on any one day, you might conclude that. But if you look at what has happened in the last week or the last month, clearly the opposition are making progress.
But Gaddafi is still in power.
Well, yes. And I believe what will happen in due course, after there has been further military pressure, is that there will be uprisings in other parts of the country which currently are terrified of doing so because of the presence of Gaddafi's forces and of their fear of retaliation.
Now, finally, if there are negotiations and Gaddafi is allowed to stay on in some kind of role, does that not undermine the power of the international community? It issued this resolution at the United Nations. It tried to help the people of Libya, and then Gaddafi is allowed to stay on. Is this not a very dangerous proposition?
Well, I don't believe that the French would be suggesting that Colonel Gaddafi had a role in the ruling of Libya. The quotation attributed to one French minister is about him being somehow isolated from that role. But my point is that it is impossible to conceive of him remaining isolated. So if the risk is taken of leaving him in place during the transition, there is a serious risk of major losses once more to civilian lives as he or the forces loyal to him tried to make a comeback. So I believe it is important to stick to the terms of the UN resolution, which does not, of course, talk of regime change, but does talk of continued protection of Libyan civilians.
All right, Sir Richard Dalton, many thanks indeed for joining us. And that's all we have time for in Focus. Well, up next, as France calls for talks in Libya, the rebels say Colonel Gaddafi has no future in their country. Melissa Bell speaks to a member of the National Transitional Council in the interview. That'll be coming up after the headlines.
Contemporary art storms Versailles for a fourth time. Is Louis XIV turning in his grave at the sight of works by Bernard Venet? Join us at the Chateau as we ask the French artist what happens when the past collides with the present.
Don't miss Culture, Thursday, 5:15 p.m. Paris time on France 24.